Welcome. My name is Greg Dunkling. I direct the Business of Craft Beer program at the University of Vermont. We serve as a business school for brewery startups. Tonight's topic is germane to our continual interest in watching the craft beer sector as it evolves and changes over time. This evening, we're glad to have with us social standards analyst Jordan Breslauer. Social Standard is a consumer analytics platform powered by social data. Their website states, quote, "Our data provides complete coverage of the beverage alcohol market, enabling us to benchmark performance, identify relevant influencers, and spot emerging trends and threats before anyone else," end quote. In 2019, they issued a craft beer report, which we'll delve into this evening. Welcome, Jordan.
Hey Greg, how you doing?
I am fine, thanks. So tell us a little about yourself. How long have you been at Social Standard, and how long have you been involved in tracking the craft beer sector?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much, Greg, for having us. We're really excited to get to speak with you all today. A little bit about myself. So I've been at Social Standards for about 2 years, heading up their customer success and data analytics department. And the company actually has very deep roots in tracking the BevAl sector, as Social Standards was originally a social media app called Bartender, where people at bars and breweries would discuss what was the scene like at these establishments. So with so much engagement around craft beer happening on social media, particularly on Instagram, tracking the craft beer sector is of great interest at Social Standards. And so we've been featured giving talks about the industry at several Bank of America conferences, and our data has been featured at Brewbound by Nielsen and the Craft Brewers Association in the past. I myself also have an additional 5 years of experience tracking advertising in the BevAl sector during my time at Nielsen, so I can definitely say with confidence that this industry is near and dear to me.
Great. Well, let's dig into this report. How does Social Standard accomplish this data collection for beer as well as other industries? And could you explain, where do you get this data?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a complex process. So, in the simplest terms, what Social Standards does is we structure social conversations from Twitter and Instagram in a very similar way to how my former company, Nielsen, structures their sales data. So Nielsen, what they do is they utilize UPC codes, the information that's contained in barcodes on the back of products sold at stores. And then off the back of that, they've constructed a hierarchy off of this data. So in practice, what that means is that the sale of a Sam Adams Boston Lager at a store also counts as a sale for Sam Adams the brand, which in turn, due to its mappings, counts as a sale for Boston Beer as an organization. And Sam Adams Boston Lager is also a lager, which means that a sale of the product counts as a sale of lager and the beer category overall. And so people who use the Nielsen sales database can then pull market share statistics due to these mappings, such as what percentage of craft lager sales are Sam Adams Boston Lager. Now, what makes Social Standards unique is we're the first company to construct social UPC codes for brands, products, and other relevant topics in the verticals we cover, which of course includes beverage alcohol and more specifically craft beer. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very complex process, as capturing Sam Adams conversations on social media cannot be done by simply gathering hashtag Sam Adams conversations or hashtag Samuel Adams conversations. After all, people use colloquialisms like Sam Adams or Sam 76 or hashtag Sam Summer when talking about the product, or people also aren't great spellers, so they might misspell the brand name in a post. So in order to properly construct that social UPC code for the Samuel Adams brand, we have to have linguists who in turn are working with a machine to structure all the relevant BevAl brands, products, and topics, which allow us to understand things like which craft beer brand has the highest percentage of lager conversation, or what differentiates Sam Adams from other craft beer brands. Now, to give you a sense for the scale of the data we're collecting, Every day we process over 170,000 public Instagram posts that use beverage alcohol topics, and nearly 20K of these are about craft beer. Our linguists have also structured nearly 1,500 of the most spoken about craft beer brands on Instagram, and that includes everything from larger ones such as Brewdog to smaller brewers like Badger State Brewing, providing us with an incredibly comprehensive picture of the category. And the analysis that you see in the full report is focused on Instagram given its alignment with that moment of consumption. We see Twitter as much more where news and events happen. Instagram is really how and where and why are people consuming craft beer and other products.
Well, very interesting. I'm sure we're going to get into some of the details here of your findings. Hopefully, all of the participants this evening have received a copy of your craft beer report. And Jordan, let's delve into this report and look at the emerging trends in the world of craft beer.
Yeah, but before we do, just one last thing on that slide. I did want to allude to something that we do further on in this report, which is really measure the strength of connections.
Okay.
And given that we've structured the world of BevAl, we can see the rate that a particular topic is mentioned alongside another topic, whether that be a brand or craft beer as a category, and then compare that average rate to that of the average rate that the topic is mentioned in the average beverage alcohol conversation. And in turn, that allows us to mention the strength of connections and also understand what is differentiated about a brand relative to the category. So, for example, to translate that into English, cherry flavor may appear in only 1% of all BevAl conversations. Thus, if it appears in 3% of brand A's conversations, the strength of the connection is quite high, statistically speaking, 3 times that of the vertical. And so we'll get into that later on as we really try and identify the different flavor profiles and emerging qualities that craft beer consumers are looking for in their product.
Okay. So
Awesome.
now into
Into
state of
the intro,
craft. Tell
right?
us, take it away.
Awesome. So yeah, starting here on slide 6, this comes from our partners over at Nielsen. And what the chart is showing us is that both beer and craft beer sales are up slightly since 2017, with craft beer climbing about 6%. Now I think it's really important to note that Nielsen sales data covers off-premise sales made in stores and supermarkets. It does not cover on-premise sales made at bars, restaurants, breweries, and tap rooms, as you know. I'm sure you guys are all too familiar with a huge part of the craft beer industry's revenues. It's not every craft beer, of course, is widely distributed. On the next slide, though, what's interesting is that the conversations. So, Greg, if you go to the next slide. Sorry about that. What's interesting is that the conversations about beer and craft beer have actually declined. You can see that in the 2 lines, the orange darker one representing beer and then the lighter one representing craft beer. And that might be an indication that consumer interest and excitement in the category may be down a bit. Now, the gray bars in the background also show that total BevAl Instagram conversations are declining at a similar rate. So the issues that the craft beer industry is encountering may be similar to the issues and excitement that the entire vertical is facing. So overall, what's not seen here is that craft beer, given this similar rate of decline, has maintained a steady share of global BevAl conversations, about 10%, and a steady share of total beer conversation at about 30% over the past 2 years. So it's no more suffering that decline from in consumer enthusiasm, more or less than the rest of the BevAl vertical. I do once again want to reiterate, though, to keep in mind the differences between the social and the sales data uh, that may be driven by the fact that sales only covers off-premise occasions, while social covers both on and off-premise occasions, essentially anywhere someone would be consuming craft beer and posting about it. So in the next slide, what we cover is who is the craft beer consumer. So really just ending this intro at very high level, trying to understand what the demographics of the craft beer consumer is on social. And to understand the demographics of the craft beer consumer through social media, what we do is we examine who talks about craft beer on social and compare those demographics to those that talk about any BevAl topic on social. And so what you're seeing here are demo SKUs expressed as percentiles. So demos that show percentile scores above the 50th percentile represent what is unique about beer and craft beer consumers relative to the average BevAl consumer. So what we can see here is that both sectors skew male 30 to 44, but interestingly, a difference between the two categories, beer and craft beer, is that beer tends to skew more Hispanic, while craft beer appears to be a little bit more Caucasian skewing. So that's it for the intro section. Before we hop in, is there any question that you have, Greg, before we go into the next section?
No, I'm interested in the impact of this next trend that you're finding related to health and wellness. Your report surfaced some interesting data related to how this may be impacting the craft sector. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, before we hop into that, I think just kind of a good preface to that. We'll see in the following slides that a lot of the fastest growing topics in BevAl on social are health and wellness related. And this would suggest that there is opportunity for new innovations that cater to health and wellness conscious individuals. For example, one of the fastest growing beer varietals we see is low alcohol beer, which has more than doubled its share of beer social conversation over the past year. I think though the segment remains pretty small, it's only about 0.22% of all beer conversations, but of course it's growing. That said, though, these trends may also suggest that people are showing more passion behind topics that are concerned with diet, moderation, and self-care. And these movements overall may lead to people consuming less alcohol, which could spell trouble for the beer sector. So looking at this slide, what it shows is that health and wellness categorized topics have grown 79% since 2018 in BevAl conversations. And currently, this section of categorized topics is about 6.5% of all BevAl conversations. So a health and wellness topic in the most recent month was mentioned in 6.5% of all BevAl conversations. What's not shown here is its impact or its presence in beer and in craft beer. So in all of beer, it's mentioned in 3%, so certainly a little bit less significant than the rest of the BevAl vertical. But it is up 33% year over year. Now, while health and wellness is less important to beer, and it's growing in importance, it's actually even less important to craft beer. So what we see is that it's only in 1.9% of all craft beer conversations. And though it's up 20% year over year, that growth rate and presence is just clearly not as high as that of beer and the entire BevAl vertical as a whole. So moving on to the next slide, though, I think one thing to consider is that while health and wellness may not be frequently mentioned in craft beer conversations, this does not mean that the growth of these topics is not a threat to the industry. In fact, given topics like non-alcoholic, self-care, low carb, and low ABV do not have strong associations with craft beer, and they are things that consumers are looking for more and more, the data suggests that craft beer may not be meeting the new and emerging desires of the BevAl consumer. In addition, as alluded to before, these movements may suggest that people are starting to consume less alcohol, which could start to spell trouble for the beer sector. Now, on the next slide, we explore the long-term viability of these trends by seeing if they are fostering loyal consumers. The metric shown here, user retention, measures what percentage of those talking about a particular topic spoke about it again the next month. So for example, in that top line there, you see that 18% of those that spoke about low carb in BevAl in December 2019 spoke about it again in January of 2020. So low carb's rate has risen slowly, uh, and is well above that of the average craft beer brand, indicating that this trend is here to stay. Now, self-care, in contrast, has a more fickle consumer. It does not appear that that same consumer comes back and talks about self-care in a beval context month after month. It does, however, have a very loyal consumer in other verticals like beauty and personal care. So sometimes not saying something, my theory here is that sometimes not saying something is as powerful as saying it. So if consumers or if a consumer talks about going sober for self-care reasons, they may not ever mention self-care again when they return to drinking. Or in a more extreme scenario, they may not talk about Beval ever again if sobriety is a permanent decision. Now, on to the next slide. As previously mentioned, wellness isn't as associated with craft beer as it is with other categories in Beval. Um, so what this chart here shows is on the y-axis, how significant is that topic to craft beer conversation? If the topic falls below the 50th percentile, this means that it's less represented in craft beer than in the average Beval products conversation. If it's above the 50th percentile, the association is strong. Thus, this chart here shows that self-care, low carb, and non-alcoholic all under-index in craft beer combos, while high ABV, a topic that tends to be the opposite of health and wellness, over-indexes. So yeah, I think it's pretty interesting to see the situation uh, that we see manifesting right now, especially as we consider the rise of health and wellness and which product categories that's affecting most.
So I wanted to comment, Jordan. For those who want to add questions now, feel free to do so, or you may wait. We have a Q&A session near the end, and feel free to post them now, and we will pull up as many as we can during this evening's show. And then those who don't get questions answered, we will submit answers afterwards. So the next day or two, you will receive them via email. So I wanted to just explore just a little bit further. What are you seeing as direct competition to craft in this sort of health and wellness world that we're in? Obviously, we see growth of seltzers and cider, wine, even cannabis in some locations, some states where it's legal. Can you summarize what you're hearing out there in terms of conversations about alternatives to craft?
Yeah, it's a great question and one that probably could be an entire other presentation and one that we've had very frequently with some different members of the financial industry. I think rather than going on for hours about the topic, though, I'll focus on the impact of hard seltzers and cannabis on craft beer. So currently, we see that the hard seltzer consumer talks about craft beer at about a normative rate, I believe the last time I checked, while the craft beer consumer talks about hard seltzer at also a normative rate. So to kind of summarize what that means, essentially they no more prefer the other than the average Beval consumer. So they're both consuming the other's product at about a normative rate. Of course, given how much hard seltzer has grown though, the craft beer consumer has talked more about hard seltzer over the past year, while the hard seltzer consumer has talked less about craft beer. Now, generally, we'd call that a situation of consumer convergence, or sorry, consumer conversion, where hard seltzer is stealing some consumers from craft beer. That said, though, when you dig further into the data, only about 1% of all craft beer consumers spoke about hard seltzer during its peak this past summer. In addition, we have a metric called correlation, which measures similarity in conversation content between any two topics. And when we look at craft beer and hard seltzer, they have very little, in fact, actually almost no similarity in the context of their conversations. That indicates that the occasions and benefits that they cater to are actually quite differentiated in the consumer's mind. And so as a result, we would conclude that hard seltzer does not really appear to be having a big threat to craft beer. It is, however, a significant threat to light lager. At its peak this past summer, about 10% of all light lager consumers spoke about hard seltzer. And the conversations are continuing to grow in similarity, particularly as hard seltzer starts to become more mainstream and shift away from being only health and wellness related to being related to some of the more party heavy activities that light lager has traditionally been associated with. So overall, hard seltzer not threatening craft beer as much as it's threatening the light lager industry. As for cannabis, it remains kind of hard to tell, mainly because people aren't necessarily open to talking about cannabis on social media just yet in the same sort of detail that they talk about other industries like a craft beer, which is of course entirely legal, while cannabis is only legal in certain areas. But if you believe that the research, what most of the research is saying, that suggests that cannabis and Beval may be substitutes or lead to people drinking less, then the products that are going to be most at risk are the ones with the highest concentration of cannabis consumers. And so what we can do is we can look at grouping those that talk about each of the different types of Beval products. Look at whether those consumers over-index in talking about cannabis. The groups that over-index in talking about cannabis are the ones that have the highest concentration of cannabis consumers. And we see the two product categories in Beval that have the highest concentration of cannabis consumers are craft beer and whiskey. So those would be the two product categories most at risk from the legalization of cannabis, while wine and gin have lower concentrations and thus would be less at risk. That data is not taking into account the combination of occasions where people might enjoy a craft beer and cannabis at the same time. It's really mainly focused on the separate occasion and treating it as the possibility of the substitute.
Thanks. We won't touch on that this evening, but certainly a conversation that we have within our faculty with the craft beer program is sort of the disposable income of consumers and how that's going to play out if you only have so much money to spend on consumption of products, alcohol or cannabis. How will those decisions get made, and will there be winners and losers? And perhaps we'll come back and have a conversation about that when more states legalize cannabis. I know that your report dealt a great deal in sort of understanding better the flavor profiles that people are discussing. So let's delve into that.
Yeah, so yeah, we'll definitely get into that in this final section. I believe that's in the last couple slides. So to kind of preview this section, one of the things that we're going to do is see a lot of charts that look like this. And essentially what we're doing in these charts is we're examining and quantifying the relationship between different topics and the craft beer category. That is shown on the y-axis as percentile or significance, and examine whether they are growing in conversations within craft beer as represented on the x-axis. And so what this does, the wonderful aspect of graphing and mathematics, is it provides us with four clear quadrants for understanding how a brewery staff might respond to this data. So things in the top left have a strong connection to craft beer, but are declining in conversations. So we coded those in yellow to suggest to proceed with caution. Things in the top right, they have a strong connection to craft beer and are growing in conversation, and thus we would suggest to consider investing in these things. The bottom left, really we're not going to discuss much, but it really should be avoided as it contains things that have weak connections to craft beer and are declining. Well, finally, the bottom right-hand corner is kind of interesting. It contains potential white space opportunities, as these are things that are growing in craft beer conversations, but currently have an under-indexed representation. It might be because they're more represented in the spirits category, or they're more represented in all of beer, or more represented in wine, or some other aspect of the Beval vertical. So ultimately, these are white space opportunities, things popping up in craft beer more, more represented though in other parts of Beval, and thus could be potential opportunities for brewers to find new innovations and things to bring in new and exciting customers. So moving 2 slides forward, the first slide we're going to be looking at focuses on beer varietals. So what it shows here is that lagers, on the right side of the chart, on the rise, but haven't been as craftized as other varietals, as indicated by its under-indexed importance to craft beer. Ale, in contrast, in the yellow in the top left corner, has a strong association but has been declining. And then finally, Mexican beer, which is in the top right, has a strong association and has been growing in craft beer. And so that might suggest, if I was advising a craft brewery staff to invest more in Mexican craft beer, consider innovating in the lager segment as a white space opportunity, and consider diversifying away from ales, as those appear to be declining a bit over the past year. Now on the next slide, we go a bit more granular, and what we see here is that flavored and fruit beers, particularly the fruit flavored beers, on the right side of the chart, are growing, while IPAs and Belgian style beers are beginning to decline. So overall, the recommendation would be to consider proceeding with caution with IPAs and Belgian style beers, while encouraging one to lean into the flavor and fruit flavored beers on the right side of the chart. Now in the final 2 slides, we're really going to get into the flavor profiles that you were quite interested in. So first here, we're going to look at the qualities portion. And what we see here is hazy and sour. I'm a big hazy and sour fan myself, so I was excited to see this data corroborate my own passions. We see that these segments are growing and of course have high association with craft beer. So these are clear areas to consider to continue investing in, as I'm sure so much of the category has. What I thought was surprising and interesting is we see here that juicy is starting to slow down a bit. So brewers should proceed with caution in this space. It's not as hot of a trend as it once was. Finally, in the bottom right, I thought this was particularly interesting. Spicy and acidic, they're growing in craft beer, but are under-indexed in craft beer conversations. And that could be because spicy and acidic are things that are generally more associated with cocktails. And so they're appearing more in that, or more represented in that part of Beval conversation. But to see that they're growing within craft beer indicates that there's an interesting, potentially less touched opportunity here for brewers to consider looking more into. And then finally, on slide 19, what we see here is looking more into flavor profiles. We see that the tropical and fruity flavors like guava and especially passion fruit have strong associations and are growing within craft beer, while tangerine, in contrast, is beginning to decline a bit. Grapefruit is also a flavor profile that requires a bit more investigation, but it's certainly starting to lose some steam, and thus, much like tangerine, we would probably advise approaching that one with caution. And so with that, Greg, I really wanted to just say thank you so much for the opportunity to present. Really enjoyed this conversation, and I'd love to open the floor now up to any additional Q&A that might come from the audience.
Yeah, let's take a look at some of the questions that are coming in. So Robert Collins asked the question related to Mexican beers. Is this a U.S. National market phenomenon, or is this regional?
Great question. So our database does have a little bit of a US skew to it, given that our linguists specialize in English. So in order to collect a conversation, we have to have some form of an English language hashtag. Now, it does not mean we're not collecting conversations from around the globe or conversations that are mainly occurring in another language. So Just to put it in context, the second highest represented country within the Beval database that we have is actually Brazil. So just because we don't have all Portuguese structured doesn't mean that people aren't speaking what I would call Portuguese, like a combination of Portuguese and English in the same post. And so we are still getting some data from there. So the Mexican craft beer rise you're seeing certainly could be influenced by parts of Mexico, but given that we have an overall US skew to the database, it's probably occurring in both regions. So certainly something that we could easily explore, looking to Mexican craft beer, looking where the highest percentage of conversations are coming from, looking if it's growing within the US to further cement that trend. But interesting to see, I do know that there is some presence of Mexican craft beer, particularly in the southwest part of the U.S. And trends do generally move north and south, so some things can come up uh, from Mexico and become trends within the U.S. market as well.
We had a number of questions related to CBD and beer. What are you seeing out there, and what's the conversation uh, look like in terms, or sound like,
Yeah,
in terms of the combination of those two?
it's a good question. I'd have to look into it in more detail. I can talk to CBD more generally, obviously a growing trend and uh, very much so in food and beverage, very much so in the beauty and personal care verticals. We have seen some growth in Beval as well. We did release a CBD Insights report back in the middle of last year, where we did analyze the difference between CBD conversations between these different verticals. I'd have to go back and look at it. I apologize. The insight's not coming directly to my head right now, but I know that there has been experimentation in the space, um, non-alcoholic varieties of CBD beer, and so clearly I know that there is growth. What people are saying about it, that's covered in the CBD report, and so feel free to go to our website and download that and check out the section about Beval.
Rory has a question, and this has to do with flavor profiles.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the decline in some categories, such as bitter and hoppy, could that be those that are oldest and most explored in comparison to up and coming flavors like sours and hazies?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, sometimes you saw how big that hop bubble was. When people talk about craft beer, they talk about hops a lot. Doesn't mean stop talking about hops, right? It just means that the things that are trendy, the things that are growing, are some other things that you might want to start paying more attention to and diversifying your claims. If everybody's talking about hoppy, it might not be a differentiator as much as some of these new emerging flavors are.
Um, I wanted to just circle back to that question of sort of disposable income. Although the products are different, cannabis versus craft beer, um, is there any data that you're seeing or have gathered related to people's choices between the two? And are people with certain disposable income just picking one over the other, or are they sort of splitting their expenditures to both craft and cannabis? Anything out there that you're seeing?
Yeah, so a couple different things. The first thing to call attention to, oh, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, I froze there for a second. The first thing to call your attention to is craft beer. We see certainly catering to both middle and higher income consumers, and the people who are talking about craft beer on social are truly the craft beer consumer. There's certainly acceptance around talking about craft beer on social. It's legal. It's part of our culture. Cannabis, while continuing to become part of our culture, it is not as accepted in terms of talking about it on social. Obviously, there's impact it can have on your job in certain states, and so it's a certain type of person that's talking about cannabis on social. We tend to see that they tend to be more young consumer. They also tend to be a little bit lower income since a lot of them, some of them haven't even entered the job market just yet. So
Mhm.
as a result, right now the income levels are certainly having some disparity. Uh, and so I don't necessarily think that the person who's talking about cannabis on social is the only cannabis consumer out there. And so I don't know if the income consideration is as important or is as insightful from our data as is looking at the consumer overlap I mentioned before and recognizing that there is some overlap in terms of the person who talks about craft beer and the person who talks about cannabis, despite the demographic differences, which I think is pretty interesting.
Okay, number of questions about kombucha and its impact on the sector, craft sector. What are you seeing in terms of conversations around alternative product like kombucha?
Yeah, so huge rise in hard kombucha, but it's nowhere near the amount of social conversations that something like a hard seltzer has. So certainly a growing category aligned to all of the different health and wellness benefits um, that we're seeing continue to grow within the BevAl vertical. So certainly what we would say is poised for growth. Things that are poised for growth have high associations with other topics that are growing independently. Hard kombucha would definitely qualify as one of them. And as we've seen that enter more and more craft tap rooms, that certainly could pose some more of a threat to craft beer relative to something like a hard seltzer, which isn't really on tap. It's not served in the same sort of location. Hard kombucha does have a little bit more of an on premise nature to it than hard seltzer does. What I do think is pretty interesting also with the hard kombucha category that I've been observing recently is as hard seltzer starts to shift away from some of these health and wellness topics and diversify and become more mainstream in its conversations and start to take on more of this party on tailgating college kid centric conversation, um, it's decreasing in its association to the health and wellness category. That's kind of an interesting thing to consider. Hard seltzer really did start as a health and wellness product. The more it becomes less and less associated with health and wellness, the more that leaves opportunity for other health and wellness products to take its place. And the product that is currently has the highest association with health and wellness is hard kombucha. So what I've been noticing is there has been some consumer conversion, some consumers leaving hard seltzer and starting to drink more hard kombucha. And it's funny how perception can change reality so much as certain individuals that maybe the health and wellness crowd would frown upon are entering the hard seltzer category. They kind of want to move away to the next cool, uh, more more actually healthy thing. And of course, kombucha has a lot of health benefits and considerations that have been proven out already in the food and beverage category. So the natural extension to BevAl, similar to what health seltzer had done, makes a lot of sense.
Jordan, sort of a related area of health and wellness is gluten challenges that some consumers have. And 5 years ago, it was hard to find a gluten menu in restaurants, and of course today it's very easy to find that. What are you seeing in the world of beer?
It's a great question. And it's interesting because it's no longer as sexy of a thing, and so we don't get as many questions about it because it's kind of just an accepted mainstay at this point. Um, I think last time I checked, it's somewhere in like a range of 2 to 3% of all beer conversations. It's a pretty decent number. I mean, if we think about it, that's about um, the same as some of the other health and wellness topics that we had listed before. So, um, considering that, I think it's kind of at this point where it's very much matured. It is what it is. It's kind of maintaining a pretty steady, if anything, slightly declining uh, percentage of all beer and craft beer conversations. Um, Do I expect it to go anywhere? I don't think so. I think those that have celiac issues, and they need gluten-free craft beer, so they're going to continue to use that. But I don't see it having as much growth potential as some of these other categories. It's essentially been what it is for the past 26 months.
Rory asked a question related to sort of cross-referencing what you're seeing in the social comments of people versus beer sales. Have you done that kind of analysis and sort of line them up and see if the trend lines are similar or if they diverge in any way?
It's a great question. We have, because we have that partnership with Nielsen, which allows us to overlay the sales data. I'm a statistician at heart, so I'm always a little sensitive when we're talking about the topics of correlation or causation. But what I will say is it is interesting when you do overlay craft beer social conversations next to sales, you do actually see a decent high relationship. We're talking like R squared scores, it actually happens to fall around zero point 0.6. But I think there is some randomness to that. Um, and I think that one interesting thing to consider is going back to something I spoke about much earlier. So Nielsen sales only cover off premise. Craft beer, so many of the small craft beers especially have a lot of sales and a lot of social chatter that happens at the breweries. I mean, imagine if you have a big brewery event and everybody comes out to your brewery and there's all this conversation, all this chatter, everybody's really excited to be there. Tons of more conversations. Your conversations go way up. What happens to your sales? Well, at least according to Nielsen, nothing happens. It's just a normal day. They're not tracking the sales that you're having at your site. So correlating craft beer social conversations to craft beer sales for a lot of brands, I don't think is generally a logical thing to do because of that specific situation. But what I will say is it works quite well in some other categories, ones that particularly operate rather off premise, and their core consumer is that of the core social demographic. So when you look at the hard seltzer category, for example, we were really able to predict its rise mainly because, well, we saw the social conversations, we saw how it was retaining its consumers, we saw how it was associated with health and wellness. And if you think about it, a lot of the sales, or almost all the sales for a while, were happening almost entirely off premise. So the social curves were lining up very nicely with the sales curves, and you actually saw about a zero point 0.9 correlation between the two, which I thought really helped to validate that social can really provide that why behind the what. The sales data tells you the what. How much am I selling? At least off premise. How much am I selling? But I don't know why people are buying my product. That's where social conversations come into play because you can really see what are people talking about alongside that product and how is it different from what we see with other BevAl products or other products that are similar to the product I'm selling.
Uh, Lori had a question. Are you seeing any association between craft beer and organic in your research? How important could the certified organic brewer become in the health and wellness conversation?
You know what? I'm gonna pull that number up for you right now. Gonna do it on the spot. So let's see here. Right now, organic is in 0.4% of all craft beer conversations. That number has been pretty stable, I'd argue, over the past 2 years. It did drop a bit to begin 2019 and has risen since then. Um, its association with organic, though, is well below that of the rest of the BevAl vertical. So it's about 4 times less associated with craft beer than the average BevAl conversation. So quick math, essentially, organic is in about 1.6% of all BevAl conversations. So the fact that it's in only 0.4% of all craft beer conversations is under indexed. So organic currently underrepresented, pretty steady, if anything growing slightly. So right now, I would say that organic not really a big deal within the craft beer category. What I would say, though, is we did speak about health and wellness concerns growing. So, if maybe a significant marketing play is made towards promoting the organic nature and associating those things more with other health and wellness concepts that the consumer is growing and caring about in uh, the Beval vertical, that could help to bring in new consumers that might not have been talking about craft beer in the past.
Zach asked a question which does a great job of sort of summarizing on part our conversation this evening. What do you think um, are the upcoming beer styles or trends that consumers are looking for?
Yeah, so I guess coming back to these slides, right? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say if we're talking upcoming, like I guess a lot of people wouldn't consider hazy and sour to be upcoming anymore. Um, Obviously, we did a very selective choice of a couple. We have so many others that we could speak to. If we go a couple slides forward to, I believe, two more. Yeah, so the smaller bubbles here are things that have smaller presence in all beval. So things like acidic and unfiltered might be things that are more upcoming, arguably, or growing. One has more of an association with craft beer, the other doesn't. But acidic certainly more growing than something like uh, unfiltered. So acidic seems like something that could be potentially interesting upcoming, given it's smaller, not currently as associated with craft beer, but growing its presence within the category. Does that help to answer your
Okay.
question, or
Yeah, I hope so. Well, I mentioned earlier that we would be responding in the next couple of days with information related to questions that you asked tonight that you didn't get answers to. So we'll do our best, both on our side and our colleagues at Social Standard. We'll take a look at those questions and provide responses to them. And we'll send that to you via email. For those of you who did not get the report in advance of this evening's show, we'll send that out to you and make sure that you have that to reference. I know some have also asked about the CBD study that you folks have completed as well. So we can give you indication of where to find that report. But I wanted to close by saying thank you so much, Social Standard and Jordan Breslauer from Social Standard for this evening's program, and great conversation about the industry and where it might be going based on conversations in social media. Whether you're in the industry and trying to predict where styles, profiles, tastes may be heading, or you're simply a connoisseur of craft and are interested in, likewise, where the industry may be heading in the future. I think this report and this conversation this evening provides a lot of food for thought. So again, Jordan, thank you so much for taking time to join us, and we'd like to thank all of you for participating this evening.
awesome? Thanks so much, Greg, and thanks everybody. Really nice speaking with you.
Okay. Until our next program, good night.